glad to see you all here. This is a really nice turnout for a late in the term event. This is actually our inaugural student research spotlight that we hope will become a series in the fall. My name is Elizabeth Frengel, and I am curator of rare books in the library. And as of July of 24, after the library had received a gift, a very generous gift, I became the director of the Kim Park program for the study of the book. And so this is going to be part of that. And we hope that if you aren't on our mailing list, you will join and become a part of, this is really meant to be a cross-disciplinary program that will engage with the study of the materiality of texts from many different perspectives. So I hope that there'll be something that will be along the lines of your interest. I'm really happy today. As I mentioned, we have Jacky Yao. Some of you may know Jacky or recognize him as a familiar face. Jacky is a great friend of the library, and he's also a graduate of the college. He graduated from the college in 23, and shortly thereafter, that's when I met you, after you had already graduated. He had a degree in art history, has a degree in art history and anthropology, and then you went on to work with Sandra Heinemann, who is the founder and director of Les Illumineurs, the firm from which we got the spectacular manuscript of Roman de la Rose. So Jacky is working there now as a gallery manager, and this fall you started in the MAP program here at the University of Chicago, and he is working on medieval art and manuscript illumination. And he's going to be talking about the illuminations in the Roman de la Rose in several different manuscripts. We're lucky enough to have one, and it's out here for you on display. If you didn't get a chance to look at it before we got started, you're more than welcome to come up after the talk is over and have a look. We also have a very early 1505 printed edition. So not copied by hand, but printed, but made to look like something copied by hand. And we normally allow our visitors to turn the pages of our books. In this case, because these items are so essentially irreplaceable, we just ask for today, if you want to see a different opening, ask me or ask Jacky or ask Angela to turn the pages for you. And that's pretty much it. I'm glad you're all here. I'm going to turn it over to Jacky. And thanks so much. We look forward to this.
Okay, I'm gonna sit because it's rather long. And so good afternoon, everyone. And before I begin in earnest, I do want to express my sincere gratitude to the Special Collections and the Kim Park program for this opportunity to speak here. And I want to thank you for everybody to take the time to be here. And it's truly a pleasure to share this work with you. I would like to begin with a quote, actually, which I wrote down during one of my many visits to the recent and truly exceptional exhibition here at the Special Collections. In an age dominated by digital media, it is not surprising that the attention to and appreciation for the material details of texts, typeface, paper source, the ways words and image are arranged on a page are of growing importance. And this statement resonates deeply with the focus of my research, which centers on precisely this material dimension, this aura, if you will, of books. But not just any books. I study illuminated manuscripts, those meticulously written and painstakingly painted books, created entirely by hand. And the production and context of medieval manuscript invites us to reading experiences that are profoundly different from those offered by modern critical editions, like what I have here. And manuscripts are not books in a strict sense defined by the printing press or the mechanical reproduction, nor were they ever solely about the text alone. Rather, they were visual, tactile, even performative objects with meanings embedded not only in what is written, but how text and image interact on a page, and in the very ways that they were made, handled, and viewed. And with this in mind, I want to turn to a central question that guides my talk. What does it mean to read an illuminated manuscript today? And more specifically, how do we, as modern readers and viewers, encounter a work like the Roman de la Rose, which all of its visual and textual complexity is resistance to single interpretation? This talk explores this richly embodied multisensory experience of reading illuminated manuscripts from the Roman de la Rose through their frontispieces, and I examine moments where illuminations function not as decorative supplements, but as hermeneutic interpolations that shape the text meaning through sensorial exposures. Engaging the body as much as the intellect, they immerse the viewer in an interpretive space where touch, vision, and movement are integral to meaning making. I focus on 3 14th-century Parisian manuscripts. One is from the University of Chicago, attributed to the Master of Saint-Vault, which is here, and the 2 by the husband and wife workshop of Jean and Richard de Montbaston, now in Düsseldorf and Paris. Written initially by Guillaume de Loris around 1230 and completed after his death by Jean de Meun around 1275, the Roman de la Rose is arguably the greatest love story in French literature. What begins as a refined courtly dream vision about the pursuit of love gradually unfolds into an encyclopedic treatise, touching on themes as wide-ranging as philosophy, morality, religion, science, and classical learnings. The richness and complexity of the Rose made it one of the most widely read and debated secular texts of the Middle Ages. It sparked the first major literary debate in French history around 1400s, and even today, scholars across fields from literature to art history to philosophy and gender studies continue to publish hundreds of books and articles each decade in an ongoing effort to interpret its layered meanings. And the poem was among the most widely copied literary works in the Middle Ages. Even today, 328 manuscripts survive, a staggering number by any standard. And of these manuscripts, 253 are illustrated, an extraordinary figure that speaks not only to the poem's popularity, but also to the central role of imagery in its reception. However, under the influence of humanist ideals, earlier illuminations of vernacular literature has often been dismissed by art historians as formulaic products of undereducated, commercially driven artisans who prioritized speed over quality, and that they serve primarily as visual chapter markers rather than offering deeper interpretive insight. However, evaluating such images solely based on their appeal to modern aesthetic sensibilities imposed a value system alien to medieval manuscript culture. And to view miniatures as merely functional or decorative is to overlook how intricately image and text co-construct meaning, particularly in the Rose, a narrative so sensorially conceived that it is inextricable from its illuminated imagery. And with this in mind, I will now turn to a close analysis of the frontispieces of these 3 Rose manuscripts. And to provide some context, almost every illuminator since the 13th century treated the Rose incipit very seriously. They took special care to illustrate the opening lines of Guillaume de Loris' section, where the author tells us that some 5 years ago, his younger self dreamt that he was awakened on a spring morning, dressed, ventured out of town in a picturesque countryside filled with flowers, birds, and a stream. He eventually encountered the Garden of Déduis, a dedicated hunting ground for the god of love, and the garden was enclosed by high walls, as you can see there, adorned with painted or sculpted images of the 10 allegorical vices representing adversaries of love and youth: hatred, felony, villainy, covetousness, greed, envy, sadness, old age, hypocrisy, poverty, quite a lot. After contemplating the portraits of these personifications, the poet was admitted into the garden by Oasis, the personification of idleness or leisure, and inside he discovered an enchanting space filled with exotic trees and abundant animals. At its center lay the well of Narcissus, where the poet, soon to become a lover, first glimpsed the reflection of a rosebud, an object he will only attain in Jean de Meun's continuation over 18,000 lines later. Almost all illuminated Rose manuscripts contain a frontispiece encompassing part or all of the opening lines from the episodes above. And to begin thinking about a different epistemology of reading, first I would like to turn to a manuscript on display here, the University of Chicago Library MS 1380. And this Rose, produced in Paris around 1365, was an ambitious project. It contains 43 single-column miniatures just in this single volume. It has another second half, which is different text, And there's a whole story about its reunion, which you could find at the University of Chicago website, which I encourage you to look, which is really fun. And it contains 43 single-column miniatures executed by a single scribe and a painter known today as the Master of Saint-Loup, an artist trained in the circle of the illuminators working for King Charles V. Although more modest in scale than the two other manuscripts I'll discuss later, this frontispiece still contains, nonetheless, it commands immediate visual attention. And even before the reader's eye meets the text, the page insists on being seen. And I offer this frontispiece as a fitting example of how illumination can guide us towards a more embodied sensory mode of engagement with the manuscript. On the foreground, a crowned figure lies casually on his bed, eyes closed. At the foot of the bed sits a second figure, a slightly older man with a tonsure, dressed in a scholar's robe. He leans towards an open codex on a scribal desk, holding a quill in his right hand and a knife in his left, as if he's scraping away something he's just written. Between the bed and the desk, a blooming rosebush stretches upward, its red and white blossoms curling towards both the sleeper and the writer. The identities of these figures become clearer as the reader turns to a textual opening, and the prologue, in the voice of Guillaume de Loris, reflects how the truth concealed in dreams, citing Macrobius' commentary on Cicero's dream of Scipio. At first, the sleeping figure appears to be Scipio himself, but then a first-person narrator steps in, as an older poet narrator recalling the dream he had at the age of 20. The sleeper thus acquires a dual identity, both as Scipio, whose dream foregrounds the poet's meaning, and as the poet-dreamer, whose romantic vision will unfold in the narrative that follows. The poet's dream centers on the desire of a rose, symbolizing both the beloved as the object of erotic longing, and as the hidden meaning of the poem as the object of intellectual pursuit. For there is no word more befitting to call this love than a rose, so we're told. The narrative becomes a retelling of this dream, aptly titled The Romance of the Rose. And the frontispiece thus visually anchors the poem's central themes, dreaming, desiring, and the act of interpretation through writing. More specifically, the image encapsulates the act of looking and reaching towards the body, as the rose stands in for bodily desire, its branches leaning towards the sleeper's left hand, which is subtly raised as though trying to grab the stem, and the seated poet, possibly modeled on Jean de Meun, himself likely tonsured, turns towards his younger self and squints toward the rose as he leans into his work, and his posture suggests both an introspection and physical engagement, a gesture of remembering, revisiting, and re-examining the self through the act of writing. Notably, later in the poem, the very gestures of shaking the rose and writing with a pen are used as metaphors for sexual union, that is, for the fulfillment of desire. And more, the knife resting on the page adds another dimension. And in medieval manuscript culture, the quill and knife were standard tools, the quill for writing, the knife for scraping away errors. Though authorship and copying differ conceptually, both share the same embodied gestures. And the frontispiece, then, may also allude to the scribe who made this manuscript. And interestingly, the scribe made an unusual number of mistakes for such a luxury manuscript. And in later folios, we find extensive erasures, crossing outs, and overwriting, even a large missing passage added into the margins. And this opened up a playful possibility, since the scribes typically completed the text before the artist added the miniatures, and the artist painted by reading instructions and rubrics, if not the poem itself written out by the scribe. Perhaps the Master of Saint-Loup deliberately depicted the author figure scraping the page to subtly poke fun at the error-ridden text copied by his absent-minded colleague. Erasure, however, was not limited to production. It was common in readership and ownership. And on this very first folio, part of the border has been scraped away to insert a later coat of arms. And deeper in the manuscript, we find many ownership inscriptions that have been erased and replaced throughout the 16th up until the 20th century. So the frontispiece becomes a self-aware image, a visual pun that encapsulates the life of the manuscript as an object of desire, touched, altered, and reinterpreted across time. And it draws attention not only to the acts of dreaming and writing, but also to the manuscript's ongoing object history and the many bodies that have shaped it. It invites us as readers and viewers to engage not only intellectually, but bodily, with a page that is meant to be interpreted, that is, by seeing, touching, erasing, and writing on a surface where meaning arises beyond the text alone. And I hope this close visual analysis has attuned us to the way in which illumination can embody meaning, inviting us to read not just with the mind, but through the senses, through the gesture, and through the material presence of the parchment folio. If the University of Chicago manuscript still closely follow the textual narrative, then the next two frontispieces I'll discuss departs from it freely. An embodied reading reveals the depth and intentionality of these images, whereas a strictly text-based approach risks dismissing them as bad paintings, hastily produced by commercial artists with little thought for the text they accompany. I disagree. And we know that these two frontispieces are the work of Jeanne de Montbaston, who, together with her husband Richard, ran one of the most prolific workshops for vernacular manuscripts in the mid-14th-century Paris. Administrative records document the Montbaston's business activities from sometime between 1338 and until after 1353, on Rue Neuve Notre-Dame. Richard died shortly before July the 21st, 1353, on which date his widow, Jeanne, pledged an oath with the University of Paris under her own name, formally taking ownership of the workshop. It's also important to note that the Montbastons were, by all measures, the foremost illuminators of the Rose in their time. We know of 20 extant copies from their workshop, not to mention fragments, far more than any other illuminator associated with the poem. Curiously, although working side by side for a period over 25 years, the couple made distinctly different creative choices when it comes to Rose frontispieces. The most refined work of Richard employs a visual strategy faithful to the poem's opening, by compressing a series of temporarily successive events into a single, undivided miniature. The poet-dreamer is shown multiple times within the same frame to suggest movement and the passage of time, guiding the viewer's eye from left to right in a sequence that mirrors the linear flow of reading. Jeanne, on the other hand, never used this strategy at all. Her two frontispieces discussed here stand out for their unusual and, to my knowledge, unique bipartite composition. In both, the top register shows the poet in bed with a rosebush behind, and Oiseuse standing atop the wall. The lower register features Dangier, personification of danger or rebuff, the lover's most fearsome adversary, alongside 9 of the 10 vices, all gathered around the doorway. Nowhere in the Rose do we read anything ever close to the depicted scene, and I believe this is where image begins to generate meaning and guide our reading of the text. If Jean's frontispiece emphasized the desire by foregrounding the two key figures, Oiseuse and Dangier, as both are absent in her husband's best works. They are gatekeepers aligned with opposing forces of access and denial. Oiseuse, often painted as a keyholder, is the gatekeeper of the Garden of Love. He generously grants the dreamer access, initiating his journey into the allegorical landscape of desire. Her position near a prominent red door, which she gazes toward, affirms this role. And the same doorway appears in the lower register, this time besides Dangier, and later described in the poem as one of the doorkeepers of the fortress, where the rose, the ultimate object of desire, is locked away. Jean's composition invites us to contemplate not just the narrative tension, but also the very pursuit of meaning, as Oiseuse and Dangier control the admission or rejection not only into the physical spaces of the garden or the fortress, but into the deeper allegorical domain. If the garden represents the dreamer's initial entry into the allegorical garden of love, where he is transformed into the lover through the awakening of desire, then the rosebud signifies the culmination of that desire, not merely as an object of erotic fulfillment, but as the ultimate promise of meaning that the poem claims to enclose. And this reading is reinforced by the incipit rubric, which is the things outlined in red. which frames the rose as a bearer of enclosed meaning. Quote, "Here begins the roman de la rose, in which the art of love is all enclosed." The poem's prologue intensifies this promise of truth, and to quote, "For as for me, I believe that dreams are full of meaning." The language of enclosure and eventual revelation invites a mode of reading defined by desire, to enter, to uncover, to interpret. An even greater hint is offered just after the reader flips past the first folio recto, and at the very beginning of the verso, one encounters the closing lines of Guillaume's prologue, in which he famously invokes the logic of concealment and revelation. Quote, "Many things are said covertly, that upon reflection one later sees more openly." Here, the allegorical promise that what is hidden will eventually be revealed takes a physical dimension, enacted through the very act of manuscript reading, as the reader moves back and forth between the frontispiece and the prologue, opening and closing the parchment folios, covering and uncovering text and images. The movement of interpretation is made tangible. And in this sense, the act of reading the rubric and the prologue while looking back at the frontispiece mirrors the dreamer's own desire to move from the outside to the inside, from dream to meaning, from covertly to openly. Both Guillaume de Lollis and Jean de Meun later reaffirmed the same promise again and again. Unlike many other contemporaneous painters who preferred more panoramic representations that unreservedly offer a bird's-eye view of the garden, Jean's composition withheld interiority, showing only the outside wall, denying any spatial depth, and thus rendering it almost impenetrable. The viewer's sight is blocked by the presence of a crowd far from pleasing to the eye, dreadful vices led by Dongier and descending from a wall. The lack of depth in Jean's second register forces us to confront this group of grotesque characters and to observe and contemplate their appearance and action. And in doing so, I argue she foregrounds the act of looking itself. Jean's visual strategy implicates the reader in the poem's structure of desire, inviting reflection on how meaning is produced through their own participation, and her frontispiece staged the act of looking and reading as a form of desiring. As our gaze moves from the upper to the lower register of Jean's frontispieces, we irresistibly perform a kind of visual and conceptual transformation. The upper register initiates the dream narrative, making the start of the allegorical journey in a third-person perspective, while the lower register dramatizes the desire to enter the garden, to see the rose, and ultimately to make meaning. This structure marks a shift in perspective as the viewer moves from the passive observer to active participant. In the lower register, we are no longer watching the dreamer, but drawn into the dream itself, whereas seeing what he sees. The boundary between spectator and participant collapses. Moreover, in Guillaume's text, this moment is rendered through ekphrasis, a vivid verbal description of the images that the dreamer saw on the garden wall, and Jean's image as revisualization of a textual description of a visual representation, collapses the act of reading, seeing, writing all into one, and implicating the reader in the dreamer's gaze and the poet's interpretive discourse. It presupposes the reader's embodiment with the text, thereby merging the roles of reader, viewer, and narrator. Now, as the narrative world coincides with our own world through the medium of the manuscript, the text can be experienced in a vision. The eye of the reader, viewer merges with the eye of the poet, dreamer, collapsing vision and subjectivity into a single point of entry, where to read is to see, and to see is to speak. Furthermore, we're embodied not only through the faculty of sight, but also through the many sensory axes where the both worlds converge. The opening of the rose is indeed a feast of senses, set in the month of May, as is now, perhaps as hot. The dream vision unfolds a landscape of extraordinary sensual abundance. Outside, the hearing is drawn to the joyful birdsong. The sight is met with a dazzling array of colors. The smell stirred by the fragrance of blossoms. The touch and taste is awakened by cool waters as the dreamer washes his face by the stream. In short, even before gaining admittance to the enchanting garden, all five of his senses are immediately and continuously engaged. Then comes the awe-inspiring discovery of the garden wall, Upon this wall, we're told the vices are painted in gold and azure, the very colors most prized by medieval illuminators and the dominant palette in Jean's frontispiece. Therefore, to read the rose is to be drawn through a choreography of the senses, where the sight initiates the experience, but the whole body is implicated in its unfolding drama. Medieval readers would have been well tuned to this implication of the body in reading. Throughout the Middle Ages, reading was regarded as a profoundly sensorial operation. In the 12th century, theologians like Hugh of St. Victor and William of St. Thierry addressed reading in physical terms, emphasizing the stimulation of major sensory organs. Reading can be exceptionally dangerous, as sensory receptivity can be a gateway to corrupt carnality. Readers of the vernacular Romance were indeed implicated, if not among the most susceptible, to the very sins of carnality. Once the readers are somatically and epistemologically evolved outside the garden, Jean's frontispiece becomes a field of imminent danger. They enact both an invitation to enter and discover, and also a warning. To read is to look, and to look too closely is already to risk being drawn into the fatality of reading. If reading implicates obliquely the sinful and the sinning body, then dancing is no doubt indicative of an outright, full-bodied enactment of vice and death. So we are taught by the numerous sermons since the 13th century. And unlike most other illuminators, including her husband, Jeanne did not depict the vices as images painted or sculpted on the wall. Instead, they become animated personifications dancing in a carol, a medieval round dance right near the garden entrance. And this arrangement appears to visually mimic the next narrative episode, the dreamer drawing the carol of the god of love and his entourage inside the garden, which Jeanne set out to depict in a similar fashion several folios later. While the vices do not hold hands like those inside the garden, they stand shoulder to shoulder, heel to toe, so closely that their bodies sometimes touch or appear to embrace each other. This physical proximity emphasizes the tactile dimension of the scene, and Jean's frontispiece conjures what might be called a danse macabre of the senses, a parodic carol led by Dangier, where tactile intimacy and visual seduction signal mortal peril. Although the iconography of the danse macabre would not emerge until the beginning of the 15th century, Jean's carol of the vices appears eerily prescient of this massively popular theme that would gain momentum within just a few decades. Let's not forget that the Montbastons spent the years before, during, and after the Black Death. It is possible that Richard even fell victim to one of the recurring waves of plague that swept through Paris. We can perhaps empathize more deeply with the medieval anxieties of mortality and morality, as the recent pandemic is similarly woven into the fabric of our daily life, reshaping our attitudes towards the theme of transience, loss, and the fragility of life. In such a setting, even the most courtly or allegorical scene takes on a double resonance, where the intensive involvement of bodily experience may allude not only to desire, but to the intimate nearness of death itself. In 1376, not long after Richard's death, the Parisian poet Jean Lefebvre composed The Respite from Death, an autobiographical poem following his survival from a devastating wave of plague. In it, he offers the earliest known reference to the danse macabre, a dance that invites all to the grave. He also expresses the desire not to end up with the other bones in the cemetery of the Holy Innocents in Paris. And this striking co-occurrence of the danse macabre and the Saint Innocents predates nearly half a century of the famous mural painted on the cemetery walls between 1424 and 1425, considered the origin point of all later dance of death imagery. Jean's frontispiece, in concert with Guillaume's ekphrasis, offers a compelling prefiguration to the mural. Both dances are painted on the wall, both are juxtaposed with and animated through text. The mural is noticeable for its authorial voice introducing the dance, as you can see from the text above the images. And both are adapted and disseminated in codex form as manuscripts and later as printed books. Together, image and text depicting the garden wall establish an interpretive frame, positioning the wall as a threshold where the image and text, where the meaning of a collective medieval consciousness emerges. Much like how St. Innocent's mural functioned in a public devotional space. For the dreamer, joining the gavel was more about dancing. It becomes a temptation to physically approach the dancers' bodies and observe them intimately. Intensive looking was his very first move after entering the dancing crowd. In Jean's visual rendering, the same temptation unfolds outside the garden, before the gavel of the vices. And this is not only the dreamer who looks, but also the reader, reflected by the figures in the margin. Turning their eyes to the left or right, the marginal figures in these golden medallions, they either look at one another or they intentionally look inward towards the central frontispiece. And even some of those vices appear to be conscient of their gaze, looking beyond the picture plane and gesturing with their hands toward the margins as if reciprocating the attentiveness of the bust figures. In Parisian manuscripts of the period, the medallion portraits were the popular marginal feature. Notably, Richard consistently avoided the use of marginal medallion portraits and instead favored more conventional stock motifs of Gothic grotesques, hunting scenes, and hounds chasing hares. Even in manuscripts where the couple clearly collaborated on the same page, as you could see there on the right-hand side, the medallion portraits remain consistently reserved for Jean's hand, and this stylistic distinction points to a conscious artistic choice and deliberate division of labor. Medieval manuscript margins have long been recognized as the site for artistic freedom and subversion in dialogue with the central textual narratives. Jean's exclusive handling of the medallion portraits offers an individual mode of artistic engagement markedly different from the stock marginalia favored by Richard. And I argue that these medallions invited the viewer into a space of self-identification, courtal association, and moral reflection. The Montbastons were among the favored illuminators of the Parisian elites, and the 6 medallion portraits from Arsenal succinctly captures this clientele. Among them are a pope wearing a tiara, a cardinal with a red galero, a bishop in a mitre, and a crowned king and queen. The 7 medallions from Dusseldorf add another layer of diversity, as these heads represent a diverse group of well-dressed, presumably aristocratic people of different genders and ages. It would not be hard for the medieval owners of these books to self-identify with one of those figures through appearance, gender, age, fashion, or social symbol. Moreover, in some cases, self-identification in the margin are purposely encouraged, where coats of arms are inserted in between the portrait medallions, and taken together, they are carefully curated visual cues of social identity and affiliation. But these marginal figures do more than just simply reflect the identity. They introduce sensorial precariousness as sites of self-mirroring. The page is not simply read, it embraces and implicates the body that reads it. The margin is a site of unique spatio-temporal complexity that implicates the reader's own body. As the reader's hands turned each folio, they physically touched the margins, leaving subtle signs of presence, finger smudges, worn corners, ink marks, or even torn corners, and doubling the sight of visual likeness with the intimate corporeality. Moreover, circular and reflective, the medallions may have functioned just like mirrors. Made with burnished silver or gold, they would have surely reflected the face of the manuscript reader when new, literally collapsing the distance between the subject and the object, as one's own likeness stared back from the image. In this sense, the visual and physical traces of the reader's embodied self is thus mirrored and doubled in the margin. The margin becomes thresholds between image and text, reality and functionality, self and protagonist. Jean thereby turned the margin into a surface of self-absorption and making the reader a participant of the rose's visual verbal architecture. Much like the dreamer who is drawn into the god of love's Carol inside the garden, the reader now has all the somatic faculties to join the danse macabre of the vices outside the garden. The mise en page of Jean's two frontispieces thus reiterate both the allure and the danger of reading. When their medieval owners read, they first saw the reflection in the margin. As they desired to enter into the allegorical text, they first touched this gateway to a precarious stance. This idea of moral and bodily confrontation extends beyond Jean's manuscripts and connects to a broader medieval tradition of the macabre. What unites them is a shared emphasis on the moral reflection by means of visual confrontation, a combined staging of speculum and spectaculum, that is, mirror and spectacle. Consider the Transitium of Cardinal Jean de la Grange, constructed in Avignon around 1402. Transitiums quickly became a popular type of funerary monument for the Northern European social elite in the late 14th century. Now in ruins, this tomb was a true spectacle of the macabre. On the floor level lies the carved corpse of the cardinal, skeletal, partially decomposed, and barely covered by a tattered shroud. Above this grotesque scene once rose a multi-storied stone armature, where the idealized body of the cardinal stood amidst his spiritual family. But what concerns us here is the surviving section of the lower register. Directly on top of the decaying body, once were 7 sculpted heads: 2 cardinals, a pope, a bishop, a king, a young prince, and a burgher. Remnants of the bishop's mitre and one of the cardinal's galeros still remain visible today. This arrangement of the heads visually and functionally corresponds to Jean's marginal medallions, contain bust-length portraits of various social types from different estates, of different physiognomy, and both border a macabre image. The viewer is invited to recognize themselves among the represented, as inscribed on a banderole running in between the cardinal's dead body and the busts. Many of the themes implicit in Jean's margins are made explicit by this inscription. The macabre featured in the pictorial center is staged as a spectaculum for the livings to see. Doubled as a speculum, the viewers of different classes, sexes, and ages not only identify the mirror images reflected within the sculptured bust or painted medallion, but are simultaneously forced to confront the inevitable fate that awaits them. The Transitium evokes yet another subject central to the macabre tradition: the vanity of pride and the urgent call for repentance. The same moral framework appears in A Tale of the Three Living and the Three Dead, a 13th century poem widely circulated in manuscripts. Notably, this short poem was sometimes intended to be read together with the Rose, commissioned and bound within the same codex. The tale opens with the introduction of 3 arrogant noblemen. One day, God gave them a mirror to reflect their pride, and what they saw within was utterly foul to the eye: 3 corpses eaten by worms. Shocked, each expressed a different reaction, from fear to denial, and the 3 corpses replied, declaring that, "Such as you are now, so once were we, former noblemen of wealth and pride, and that, as we are now, so shall you be." The macabre turned out to be an admonishment of the fleeting quality of life in the body, appealing for the necessity of spiritual growth. And this tale, succinct yet compelling, rapidly gained prominence across Europe, not as text but also as iconography. Commonly referred as the encounter of the 3 living and the 3 dead, is a key precursor to the Dance of Death tradition, and nearly 200 mural paintings and numerous manuscript illuminations survive. One of the earliest visualizations appears in the late 13th century Parisian manuscript that also contained the Roland de la Rose. The manuscript opens with a tale illustrated by a 2-column frontispiece that would become the standard manuscript iconography in the 14th century, such as the encounter from the later De Lille Psalter. The image is structured in 2 parts. On the left, 3 young nobles standing elegantly dressed. On the right, they are confronted by 3 skeletal corpses covered in rags and in various stages of decay. Animated and gesturing towards the nobles, the scene conjures an uncanny reminder of mortality. The elongated miniature format and the linear arrangement of the 6 figures closely echo the second register of Jean's 2 frontispieces, and a similar attention is also given to the physical contact. 2 of the young nobles are holding hands, while one of the corpses is touching the other's shoulder. Another important quality of the encounter is its symmetrical arrangement of the figures, as if reflected through an uncanny mirror, and which we infallibly look when reading the manuscript. To quote art historian Paul Binsky, the corpse as image stands for the absence, that is death, returning to rebuke both the image living and also ourselves as onlookers. The macabre implicates us in a mise en abîme, a hall of mirrors, and by means of its defamiliarization, it offers the capacity for self-examination. The organization of the macabre image is thus not binary, but ternary, implicating the third-party viewer. And in brief, the encounter operates according to the same logic as Jean's Gabble of the Vices and as the Transitum of Jean de Lagrange. All are unsettling specula that encourage active viewer engagement and embodiment by inviting self-recognition, which is an essential part of their meaning-making mechanism. Taken together, Jean's opening page activates a layered process of embodied self-conscious reading, in which the spectacle of the vices become both an interliminal threshold and an effective mirror, prompting the reader to identify themselves socially, spiritually, and morally. Meaning is not something hidden behind a wall to be definitively uncovered. Rather than presenting the garden wall as merely obstructive, Jean transformed the outside into a place of active interpretation, one that makes the reader part of the manuscript and of the rose itself. To conclude, what I've tried to show through these frontispieces is that reading a Roman de la Rose manuscript was, and still is, a richly embodied experience. They remind us that reading in the medieval context was not detached, purely intellectual exercise, but a deeply sensory and affective act. The Chicago manuscript draws us into this world through a frontispiece that stages dreaming and writing as tactile, introspective acts, reminding us that image can be self-aware, reflecting not only the narrative, but also the manuscript's own object history and the many hands that has shaped it. Jeanne de Montbaston, in turn, pushes this engagement further. Her composition implicates the reader more directly, inviting them not only to show a narrative, but to enter into it, to see, to touch, to mirror, to be mirrored, and to become a spectacle. And perhaps, in a time when so much of our reading happens on flat screens, returning to these pages reminds us of how meaning is carried not just in what we read, but in how we look, how we touch, and how we turn the page. Thank you.